you all. We're here for a hearing on the merits in two matters. In a single matter entitled Inri Car Group LLP Major Site Plan and Conditional Use Approval, docket number 74-6-13 VTEC. This matter was the subject of a prior hearing on a pretrial motion to stay certain demolition plans. We issued an order, after the hearing, we issued an order in regard to that motion. The request for stay was granted on a temporary basis, and then, but the request for a stay on a permanent basis was denied after the hearing. Thereafter, there were several pretrial motions. I mention them only because it helped me prepare for today's hearing and reviewing those decisions again. I have, in reviewing that and the materials that have been filed since the November hearing, have some context about what we will address in this merits hearing today. I thought to ask before we begin if I have an accurate understanding of where we stand right now. And my understanding is this, that the appellant's concern is focused principally on the historic structure known as the Smith House. That the additions that were made subsequent to the Smith House, after it was converted from a residence to a commercial facility or a nonprofit host facility, those additions are not of concern to the appellants. I don't know if demolition has begun on those or not, but I understand that we're not going to address that portion of the facility. Is that right?
That's correct, Your Honor. Just to be clear, it's more than the structure. It's the we also want to address the parking and the traffic. And when we talk about the structure, we want to make sure that we're keeping the porch in mind, but not the larger or other part.
Yes. Yeah. No. Thank you for that clarification. I would think it's probably. Well, I wonder if my understanding is we should also add to that equation is that in connection with the court entertaining whether if the demolition component is approved, whether the plans to redevelop the site conform with the statutory provisions that talk about preserving some component of the historic structure. So that's a legal issue as well in the appellant's statement of questions. I took a look at the statement of questions. I think we narrowed them down a little bit, but we have those issues in mind.
At the end of the stay hearings, Your Honor mentioned that we would, I may have misunderstood, but that we would not have simply treated the hearings and the testimony that we heard at that level as relating only to the stay, but that they would be applied to the merits hearing. If that's acceptable to you, we are prepared to have that be incorporated as part of the merits hearing.
Yep. Yes, thank you for that too. I'm trying to remember the provision in the civil rules. Is it 26 or something that authorizes, if not directs us, to treat those exhibits that have been entered in an injunctive proceeding to be admitted in the hearing on the merits? And because of that provision, again, I can't remember the specific site. I think it's in the record that I thought it fair to give notice to you folks that we would treat it as such unless there's some objection.
Well, I was assuming also not just the exhibits, but the testimony that was given on the structure.
Yep.
But that is, to the extent that the appellants have an interest in that, we don't see the need for repeating all of that material.
I understand that that's the purpose of the civil provision, so thank you for that.
Judge, that was Rule 65B2 was the rule that you referred to in your decision.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, good. Mr. Feed, anything else before we begin that you can think of that we should note in this merits hearing?
Yes, Your Honor, there are two things. One is that I believe that we have stipulated to the entry into evidence of the exhibits that the appellants, I'm sorry, that the respondents, that the Connors have put in. And we do have one supplemental exhibit that I believe counsel has consented to. You have a book of exhibits in front of you.
Yep.
And the exhibits that were admitted into evidence in the stay hearing are included in there. It's not your handwritten, marked up copies, of course, but all of the exhibits are there that were put in
That's actually,
before.
it looks like from this cover sheet that exhibits 1 through 19 offered by the applicants were identified and admitted at the prior hearing.
Yes.
Okay.
And at this time, I'm going to supplement it with a newly marked exhibit 49. If I may give it to you.
Yep. Sure.
And what this relates to, Your Honor, is an order that's been entered in the court already.
Is that the thing that came in just recently and
The consent
about the
order.
parking in the
Yes, Your Honor.
one-way direction of the street
Exactly.
of Maiden Lane?
Exactly. And so that there was a minor amendment to the subdivision, to the site plan that was applied for and granted, and the time to appeal that permit has expired without anyone appealing it, although I understand that that's the reason why we brought it into this matter is because it has become part of the appeal in this matter, so that I believe the neighbors are going to be speaking to those issues. But I thought it was important that Your Honor be aware that no one else has appealed that permit when Your Honor goes to rule on it.
Okay, very good. And that exhibit 49 reflects, certified that as of May 7th, which is today, there were no appeals. The letter's not dated. When did you receive it?
Well, Your Honor, today is May 7th.
So, I just want to be sure.
On the way to the courthouse, right?
I'm just gonna put that it was received 5/7/14. I'll put my initial below that, just so we have it right.
Thank you,
Okay?
Judge.
All right, now as to the other exhibits that will be introduced today,
Yes.
I understand that there may be a stipulation as to their admissibility, and I thank you for that. I've asked two things. Introduce the exhibit, of course, through the witness's testimony, so I understand what the context of the exhibit is. And then I think that even with your stipulation, which I'm very grateful for, I need to formally admit the exhibit, so we have that record that they've been admitted. So how do we remember to do that?
But would it be appropriate to admit them now?
We could if you like, in mass, sure.
I just need a copy of that list.
Yeah.
I think the court officer could give me a copy.
Here, I've got one.
You have a spare copy, Mr. Freed?
Yes, it doesn't go to 49.
So, Mr. Gillis, just to be clear, you're suggesting that we admit, based upon the stipulation, exhibits 21 through 49.
Yes. But, and I say that only because it just will slow things down if we
Okay.
go through that, unless Your Honor feels some.
No, I just want to make sure I do my job of having a record that reflects that they're admitted. If we admit them all now, that's fine by me. Okay, so exhibits 20 through 49 are admitted based upon that representation. And the last, Mr. Chairman, the Markham,
I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm trying to understand the impact of the new exhibit 49, and just wanted some clarification if
understanding, and certainly was our intent with the consent order, to have this appeal be these appellants' appeal of that minor site plan amendment. Yes, I just wanted your honors to be aware that nobody else has filed an
Yeah,
appeal.
because if I remember, the statement of questions did note parking and traffic issues, so that's certainly an issue that the appellants have preserved. I understood from the prior stipulation, which we signed as an order
Recently.
that there's been a revision.
Yes.
Which we deal with this kind of thing a lot, because sometimes revisions are made for business reasons by developers, sometimes they're made in the hopes that it will accommodate some, if not all, of neighbors' concerns. I don't know which category this one falls into, but we're putting in place the amended parking plan, which we have not yet heard about, and that will still be the subject of the appellant's challenge in this appeal.
One other item, Your Honor, we have agreed that because of their schedules, that Mr. Melly and Mr. Keith might be taken 1 and 2 so that they may go back to their business.
Yeah.
Mr. Keith may be speaking about parking and the traffic, and if so, here maybe we're getting the horse before the car. I don't know if that's, I'm just putting that out there so that we know that.
Let's do this. Assuming that we're not beginning with Mr. Keith as the first witness, why don't we begin with the taking of evidence? During a break, I asked if you would confer with Mr. Feed, and whatever schedule of witnesses you folks want to come up with is great. And if you can't come to an agreement, that's fine too. We'll present it to us, and we'll and I'll make a ruling from there.
It's the order that we just agreed to is all that we're concerned about.
Okay.
We'll wait our
Yeah.
turn. I just didn't want to have evidence being put on about the traffic and the parking after someone testifies to what they think of it.
No, fair enough. I mean, I leave you and your client to decide how best to present the case. It's preferable to hear the advocate for a project before we hear its critics. But people's schedules don't always allow us to go by that, so we can hear from Mr. Keith and his concerns, and I'll take notes and I'll keep those in mind if in fact the applicant's presentation on traffic and parking comes after this presentation. Whatever you guys do.
Your Honor, just so that you have full warning of my view of this, we have conferred about the historic report that Ms. Gemelli has produced, and she's going to introduce that. Mr. Keith has put in comments about that and provided an expert report about that, and we agreed that we would take his testimony so that, and I understand that he, as a result of Your Honor's denial of our motion for summary judgment on the demolition permit, I understand that Mr. Keith may have some testimony about that, and I have no objection to taking those back to back so that we're done with the demolition aspect of the case sometime this morning.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Mr. Keith offering any testimony with respect to the issues of traffic and parking, not only was he not disclosed as an expert in those regards, nor did he provide a report about those issues, there was actually an affirmative representation in the answers to interrogatories that they would not be offering any experts on those. And so I'm going to object to that testimony generally, and so perhaps we'll get to that when we finish. Should Your Honor decide that he's allowed to testify about those things, as a matter of courtesy to the witnesses and to the court, I have no objection to taking that testimony out of order. You know, the plans are the plans that have been submitted, and they've been admitted into evidence. So, to the extent that there are comments about those things, I don't have an objection to taking them out of order if Your Honor rules that you can provide that surprise testimony at all.
Thanks for all that, folks. I appreciate. I would only ask again, that during break, you folks confer about this limited issue of, hey, is there gonna be an objection when he offers testimony about, parking and traffic? Or is there some compromise or stipulation that can be had? Failing that, we'll still allow him to be presented as a witness, and when he gets into some testimony that you and your clients object to, we'll rule on that issue.
And then probably not to talk anymore, but I just want to just make sure that we understand that Mr. Keefe is not a traffic expert, or a parking expert. He's a historic preservation expert, and his focus on the traffic and the parking is exclusively from that perspective.
Sounds good. All right, good. We'll hear from him in whatever way you wish to present him, and assuming there's not an objection that's sustained. Okay, so, with all that said, it's a turn to you, Mr. B. Ask you where you want to take this.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to start with Suzanne Gemelli, please. Ms. Gemelli, if you would move up here to the witness stand.
Stand and raise your right hand, please. You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give relative to the cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Good morning.
Hi.
Have you ever testified in court before?
No,
Are you a little bit nervous?
of course.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Well, it happens with just about every witness. And so, please feel free. You said you had a little bit of a
Yes, I've been,
throat issue. Did you bring your
I've
water?
had a respiratory virus, so if I start coughing, I brought water.
You have your water bottle there? Okay. Your Honor, will that be allowed for the witness? Thank you.
That's fine. And if you want to really have some fun, watch when a lawyer is called as a witness. So you can't do worse than that. So
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Gemelli, could you state your full name and your address for the record, please?
My name is Suzanne Gemelli. My work address is 1 High Street in Plainfield, Vermont.
What is the nature of your work?
I'm an historic preservation consultant. I work by myself. I have a variety of clients that range from private individuals to communities to corporations, nonprofits, wide range of things.
Okay, if you would turn to Exhibit 21 in the notebook in front of you,
21.
to the last 3 pages of that. Do you have it there, Your Honor? Yes. Is that your resume?
Yes, it is.
And who prepared that?
I did.
And does it succinctly summarize your qualifications in the field of historic preservation consulting?
I believe so, yes.
Right. Just could you tell us the highlights of your education and your work experience that allow you to be in that business?
Well, I have a master's in historic preservation from the University of Vermont. I got that in 1990. For 18 years, I worked at the State Historic Preservation Office in Montpelier, otherwise known as the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. 10 years of that, I was the Environmental Review Coordinator, which means I reviewed all the projects in the state that needed Act 250 review or Federal Section 106 review, or State Historic Preservation Review, which is 22 VSA 14. After that, for 8 years, I was the National Register Coordinator for the state of Vermont. So I worked with communities who were listing properties on the National Register. I worked with consultants who were preparing those nominations and reviewed the work that they prepared to make sure they met the National Park Service standards. For the last 5.5 years, I've been working as a private consultant, and the range of work that I do includes what I did in both those jobs at the Division for Historic Preservation, plus a variety of other things, including rehabilitation tax credits, which are federal tax credits that people developing properties can get for rehabbing income-producing buildings.
While you're
that's it.
taking a breath, let me have you go back a little bit in time. So Could you clarify, you said that you were working for the state of Vermont in their Division of Historic Preservation.
Yes,
And for a while, you said you did an environmental review
yes,
in connection with Act 250
yes,
and a federal statute that is similar, I believe.
yes.
And then you said that you did something else after that work in connection with a statute, a Vermont statute. Could you tell us a little bit about
In
that?
connection with the Vermont, you mean the State Historic Preservation Act?
Yes. So what it,
That's just another state law that addresses historic preservation review, largely related to things that are state-funded or permitted. It sort of parallels the federal law, but relates to state activities.
and so did people make applications that you reviewed, or were you reviewing projects that the state was proposing?
Largely, they were projects the state was doing, or that the state was granting money to do.
Okay, so when the state was granting money to do those projects, again, were you reviewing other people's applications, or, where did the projects come from?
If they were grants, yes, so they would come from whoever received the grant. It's an organization or a community or something like that.
And were you acting in a fairly independent capacity, or were you supervised in that role?
I had a supervisor, yeah.
And I see from your resume that for a while you were a visiting lecturer at the University of Vermont. What kind of work did you do there?
2 different semesters I filled in and taught a class when one of the regular professors was on sabbatical. One semester it was related, the course was related to training students how to prepare National Register nominations. The second time it was a course on, it's kind of like a community practicum where students had a community project that they worked on related to historic preservation, sort of like an internship, but and my role was to guide each of the students through that project to a successful completion.
Okay. And then from 2001 until 2008, you said that you were the National Register Specialist for the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. What did you do in that respect?
I did several things. I worked with people, communities, organizations that wanted to list properties on the National Register, gave them information on how to do that, what the process was. Worked with consultants who were preparing those nominations. When the draft nominations were completed, they came to me, I reviewed them, critiqued them. If they needed change, it went back to the consultant, and then I would review a final draft. Completed nominations were sent to the National Park Service for listing on the register. Along with that work, I worked with our own staff when there were projects that were happening and there was a question about whether the property involved in a project was eligible for the National Register. I was the person that they would come to sort of get a final answer on whether it looked like it was an eligible property or not.
Are you familiar with the Department of the Interior's historic preservation standards and guidelines?
Yes, I work with them all the time.
Now, your resume also lists some publications. Is this a current list, or have you had any publications since this time?
No, this is current.
Thank you. And you listed National Register nominations prepared. Were those during the course of your private consultancy, or was that while you were with the state?
None of them were while I was with the state. Several, let's see, the first 3, Jericho Village, Mad River Valley, and the Agricultural Resources of Vermont, were all projects that I worked on when I was a graduate student in the Historic Preservation Program. And then the remainder are ones that I have completed since I've been a consultant.
And then the presentations listed, just sort of as a general statement, what kinds of folks have you been making presentations to, and what are the general?
Most of these are not things I've done as a consultant. They were done, a lot of them when I was working at the state. I would say that that's the case.
All right. And is working as a historical consultant your full-time job?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to offer Ms. Gemelli as an expert in the field of historic preservation.
No, you don't.
All right. If Mr. Kelly is accepted as an expert witness in the field.
Thank you, Judge. Now, Ms. Gemelli, in the book in front of you, I'm going to ask you to turn to Exhibit 44. Which has been admitted into evidence. It's this section of the Land Development Regulations, Section 706-8, relating to the historic preservation here in St. Albans. And on page, the page number is at the bottom, on page 7-18, there are the standards for demolition of historic structures. Have you had occasion to review that section?
Yes.
And were you engaged by the applicants, the Connor Group, to prepare a report as required by Section 706-8E little I-1?
Yes, that was the purpose of my report. It was documentation of the building prior to demolition. Yeah.
Right. And turning back to Exhibit 21 is the front 46 pages of it, the report that you issued.
Yes.
What did you say?
I'm sorry?
Which exhibit were you just referencing?
21.
21. Okay, just wanted to be sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I noticed that it's divided into two general parts. There's text, and then there's photographs, and some photographs of buildings and parts of buildings, and some location maps and so on. Who took the photographs?
I did.
And who wrote the report?
I did.
Can you tell us, are you familiar with similar kinds of ordinances in other towns?
I know other towns have ordinances like that. I can't say I'm familiar with any specific ones in any specific communities.
Okay. Did you apply any recognized professional standards to the preparation of your report?
Yes.
What standards were those?
The standards that I used were the generally accepted statewide standards here in Vermont, which are the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation's photographic documentation standards for historic buildings.
Is that a published document?
It's readily available on the web, on the division's website.
And was that a document that you had familiarity with?
Yes, in fact, I
Working with
helped develop it when I worked at the state.
Okay. And did you follow those guidelines in the preparation of your report?
Yes, I did.
And in the photographic documentation of your
Yes.
observations? And did you visit the building?
I did.
Do you remember when you did?
I was there November 20th, 2013.
And I noticed that the report contains some historic reflection and some architectural description and some recitation of significance and so on. Did you know all that off the top of your head, or did you have to do some research?
No, I did some research.
What research did you do?
I did a variety of things. I did some research at local library here in St. Albans, at the Leahy Library in Barry, which is the Vermont Historical Society Library. I went to the State Library in Montpelier. I did some online photographic and map research. I looked at historic maps and historic photographs.
And is that the kind of research that is
That's
customarily
typically
done by experts
yes.
in your field?
Yeah.
I noticed that your report on page 12 lists references. Are those, why did you list those in your report?
Why? Because it's professional standards that you would document the sources that you use to gather the information in the report.
So these are the sources that you use to gather the
Yes.
information? Okay. Great. And so the first page of your report, can we characterize that as a summary of what's inside?
Yeah, it's like a cover sheet. Yeah.
All right. And then the second page is what?
It's a summary of my understanding of the project and why I was hired to prepare the documentation package that I did.
Okay, so in this case, the word project then is not the construction at the site, but rather it's the
My
project that somebody
project,
gave you
yes.
to do. Great, okay. And pages 3 through 5, what do they refer to?
These are location maps, site plans, building configuration plan, just to help to understand the various components of the complex property that was being discussed.
All right, and then the architectural description, is this the level of detail that comports with the standards that?
It's actually far more detailed than what the standards require. The standards require a 2 to 3 paragraph description of a building. I went into substantially more detail for 2 reasons. One, the building has many different parts to it, as the plan indicates, and in order to make that clear, it required further description than one might make in a couple paragraphs. In addition to that, the building has a number of important architectural features that required mention, and again, it was more than a couple paragraphs could sufficiently address. So it's.
And the next section starts on, it's on pages 10 and 11, relating to significance. What, where did that information come from, and what were you attempting to do there?
This information is the result of my research. Basically, the intent of the report was to document the building, the architectural features of the building and its architectural features, as well as its significance. And so this piece of it talks about the history of the building, who the people were that lived there, who built it, and their role. So, as well as the fact that the building has 2 important architectural periods, the Federal period and the Queen Anne period, represented most importantly by the front porch. So the purpose of this was to document both the architectural and the historic elements of that significance.
Okay. If you would turn for a moment to Exhibit 12. And this has already been admitted as a page from the National Register of Historic Places inventory for the historic district in St. Albans. And you'll see item 14 there with the X in front of it refers to the Owls Club, 13 Maiden Lane. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your significance, back in Exhibit 21, on page 10, you started out with, the building at 13 Maiden Lane is listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a contributing building, number 14, in the St. Albans Historic District. So this is what you're referring to then, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and how does your description of the building and your description of its historic significance compare with this statement in the registry?
It reflects this and elaborates on it.
Considerably more detail?
Yeah. And my statement clearly indicated that the building's listed on the National Register.
Sure, sure. Then on page 13, we have an index to photographs.
On page 13 of,
Your
of
report,
21?
Exhibit 21.
Okay.
And can these photographs be broken into some categories?
Yeah, the photos generally, the first few are maps, historic maps to give a sense of the development of the property. There's some historic photos, and then a number of exterior shots, basically trying to cover all sides of the building, as well as some detail shots on some of the exterior architectural features. And then there's a number of interior photos of both the the historic brick house as well as the additions in the back, and focusing on the architectural components of the building of significance.
And do these photographs accurately represent the conditions as they existed at the time you took them?
Yes.
At the time that she took them, which was in November of 2013, I believe you said?
Yes.
Who decided which pictures to take?
I did.
And how did you decide which pictures to take?
I tried to take some overall shots of some of the rooms in the in the house to get a sense of space and relationship of the components in the room in terms of trim and fireplaces and things of that nature. And then I selected some of the more important architectural features to photograph in more detail.
And were these the selection of things to take pictures of have any relationship to the standards that you were talking about earlier?
The standards don't really specify in any detail what should be taken. They basically talk about taking shots of every facade on the exterior of the building and then any significant interior architectural features. So it doesn't specify, it's based on professional judgment, and when you go into a building and what you see in terms of trim and staircases and fireplaces and things of that nature.
And did the Connor Group representatives put any limitations on which pictures you took or
No.
which areas to look at?
No, we together went through the whole building.
But you were free to take
Of course,
whatever
yeah,
you
absolutely, yeah,
in your professional judgment deemed appropriate.
yeah.
Okay. Now turning your attention to Exhibit 22. Next one. You'll see it's comprised of two things. One is an affidavit signed by you, and the other is another report. What are those? Why were they prepared?
These were prepared this winter in response to a critique of my report, and provided some additional photos to supplement things that were omitted in the first report.
And I notice that when I look through the affidavit, starting with with paragraph number 5 and going through paragraph number 27, at the end of each line, who prepared this affidavit?
Who prepared the affidavit or the report?
Well, let's start with the affidavit.
I did not prepare the affidavit. I don't know who prepared it.
Okay. Did you review it carefully before you signed it?
Yes, I did.
And verify the connection of the page references to
Yes.
the statements and
Yes.
so on? And so, regardless of who typed it, is this affidavit been sufficiently reviewed by you to be your statement?
Yes.
And then who prepared the report, the supplemental or amendment report?
I did.
And did you take some additional photographs or use some additional photographs?
No, these were photos that I had taken when I was there in November and just had not included in my original report.
Okay. So, in your professional judgment then, does this report as supplemented, or exhibits 21 and 22, comply with the requirement of section 706(8)(e), little I 1, that section of the land development regulations that we refer to exhibit 44? In other words, does it meet the standard, and I'll read it, the significance of the structure, gardens, landscaping, and outbuildings, if any, shall be assessed and recorded? Does your report, affidavit, and supplemental report do that?
I believe my report accurately documents the building and its significance.
A photographic record that includes scale shall be made part of the site inventory work. Did you do that?
Yes.
Significant architectural features or items of historic importance shall be identified. Did you do that?
Yes.
Your Honor, that completes my direct examination. Thank you.
Let me just finish my notes here. I'll just look at the regulation and I want to make sure I understood that last.
Certainly, Your Honor, it's exhibit 44.
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hi.
What were you asked to do in this case specifically? Well, first of all, who asked you, who hired you?
Connor Group hired me to prepare a documentation report of the building to satisfy the local regulation that we discussed earlier. It was purely to document the building.
What instructions were you given?
To prepare a documentation report that meets that local zoning requirement.
In terms of the work that you did, maybe I just could get some context here. What is, I don't want to use the wrong words here, but what is a significant architectural feature?
That's any item in a building that contributes to the character of the building. Typically, it would be trim features, staircases, fireplaces, material of walls and floors, framing, interior and exterior, well, on the exterior certainly, the siding, the roofing materials, trim features on the exterior porches, and you can go on, but character-defining features is how we phrase it in the profession.
The idea of features versus details about the same?
Well, the same thing, yeah.
And devices, is that a word you?
Device, not typically, no.
My word, sorry. Well, you visited on November 20th, 2013. Do you have any idea as to what features or details might have been removed before that time?
There were clearly missing elements. Whether I personally couldn't say when they were removed, if they'd been missing a long time or a short time.
We've heard reports that some of the features have been taken out of the building and sold at a restore. Are you aware of which items have been taken?
I have no idea.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the extent that the question was without adequate foundation, or vague reference to we have understanding of things being removed and so on, of features being removed. I believe the only testimony of things that have been removed may not meet the category of features.
I recall some testimony from our previous hearing. Mr. Gillis, what do you say in response to the objection?
Well, as the answer was that the witness doesn't know, it seems unnecessary to pursue it.
No, the objection allowed the testimony to continue.
Good. Thank you. How do you go about determining the significance of a structure like this in terms of, I've read your report, I've seen what you've done, but when you start, how do you identify whether it's significant or insignificant?
Well, this one was easy. It's listed on the National Register, so we know it's significant. But if that weren't the case, you would look at the building, look at its architectural style, look at how much of that's the original stylistic materials still remain, how much of it has been changed over time with various periods of renovation. If it had enough intact architectural quality, then along with that you would look at its history and put together those pieces to assess what its significance is.
Is the condition of the building essential to a determination of significance?
It's a component of it. There are times when a building has lost so much of its, we call it integrity, but its condition is so poor, either from many periods of renovation where it's lost a lot of its original material, or from deterioration. Buildings can reach a point where they no longer retain enough integrity or in such poor condition that they are no longer considered significant. But a building that's a contributing building in an historic district that retains a fair amount of its original material, even if it's in poor condition, would still be considered significant.
So in light of that, is the Smith House significant?
Yes, and I stated that in my report.
In terms of the listing on the National Register, I understood it was a nomination. Is that different than being listed?
No. The National Register nominations are called nominations. The name never changes once they're listed on the register. It's still the National Register nomination for St. Albans Historic District. That's just the terminology that's used, but that's
So
just what the...
If I nominate a building, I'm just an owner, or I hire you to do it.
Yeah.
Is it then on the register because we nominate, or is there some independent
It has...
decision?
The nomination would be prepared by me, and that's the paperwork of which you saw a page in this book. That documentation package gets submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office, who review and approve it. Then there's a statewide volunteer board called the Vermont Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, who also have to review and approve it. And then once that happens, the nomination will get sent to the National Park Service in Washington, who then review and approve it once again, and it then is actually listed on the National Register. But it's still called a nomination. It's just, that's because that's what the form is called.
But it's an approved nomination.
Yes, it's a listed nomination.
And what does that designation do? Does it give the building any special protection?
Not really. Buildings that are listed on the National Register, if there's a project that's using state or federal funds or permits, there's a federal law, the National Historic Preservation Act requires that a project using federal funds or permits be reviewed for the effect of that project on the historic resource. So any building, and that law applies to any building that's on or eligible for the National Register. So any building that's listed on the register, if there's a federal project that might affect it, that review would need to happen. However, if a building is eligible for the National, if there's a project like that, the person doing the project is required to look into whether their project might affect a building that's even eligible for the National Register. So any federally funded or permitted project must answer the question, is there a building in my project area that might be eligible for the National Register? So you get that protection whether you're listed or not, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Now, the building doesn't stand alone in a field, it's in a neighborhood, correct?
Yes.
And how does the Smith House contribute or to the neighborhood, or the neighborhood contribute to the Smith House?
They're all related to each other, and they interact as a group of structures that tell a story about the development of St. Albans. So architecturally, they have some of them, they're a piece of a puzzle.
Does the materials that make up the buildings play a role in this?
Yes. Sorry, excuse me.
Sure.
Materials are a component of what makes buildings eligible for the register. In districts, often one of the things that you look at is what are the sort of the patterns that you see in terms of architectural style, use of materials, and that sort of thing. And as the St. Albans Historic District National Register nomination discusses, brick buildings are an important component of buildings in the St. Albans Historic District. Of course, this is one of those buildings.
In the neighborhood, Maiden Lane, Congress Street area is part of the historic district?
Yes.
And who decided that it was a historic district?
Who decided, I'm sorry?
That it was a historic district?
Well, it was listed on the National Register. I'd have to look back and see, but it was like in the 1980s, I believe.
But it was done by the federal government?
Well, they're the ones that list it. I'd have to look at the nomination to see who actually prepared it and how that all came about. That was long before I was involved in this field.
Are there other buildings on Maiden Lane that are in the historic?
Yes.
That are in the National Register?
Yes. We don't have the district map here with us, I don't think, but you know, we need to look at the boundaries of the district to say for sure exactly which buildings are, but yes, some of them are, if not all of them.
And is the Smith House on the outside edge of the district?
I believe it is. Well, it's in the district, but I think the boundary is just around the...
What role does the history of those who owned the house and resided there play in the determination of the significance of the house?
It's maybe half of its significance. I mean, the building clearly has architectural significance because of its original federal component and the Queen Anne additions. So buildings can be significant for architecture, history, relationships to historic people, or archaeology. And this building, as I said, has architectural significance, and its relationship to the Smiths are another element of its significance.
So you said about half. I'm trying to understand what you mean by
I only because it's,
Total significance, or doesn't play as significant a role as?
it's equally significant. It's significant for its architecture, it's significant for its history. So half only because there's, there's two pieces of the story.
So a hypothetical, a building that has no interest architecturally, that happened to be a place where a famous person resided, could be on the National Register?
Usually there needs to be some sort of, we call it integrity, it needs to continue to have some architectural, retain some of its original appearance.
Integrity is another word that escapes me here. Does it have to do with, what does that mean?
It's professional lingo that it means how much a building retains of its original physical appearance, how much has been lost, how much is retained. If too much is lost, then someone from the past wouldn't recognize that building if they came back today.
Standing in front of the Smith House, you would say, though, that's not the issue.
That's right.
You mentioned that part of your work was with rehabilitation credits. Were you asked to do any inquiry into subject?
No, the purpose of my report was purely to document the building.
And did you have any role in reviewing the proposed structure that was set to replace?
No, I have not even seen what it is.
Once your report is finalized, I assume its purpose is to be left for those who come after so they'll understand the...
So that there's a record of the building, yeah.
And so where would your report go?
The report went, I believe the report went on file at the Connor Construction Company here in St. Albans.
It would stay with the present owner?
Well, typically if I was preparing this, how to explain this? Typically I would prepare, I usually prepare these as a result of a federal review process, and it's something that's been required by the Division for Historic Preservation as part of their federal review. And they usually will stipulate that a copy of the report be provided to them and to a local repository, local library. Since this project, I was requested to prepare it for the Connor Group, not as part of any other part of a larger review requirement by the state. The only copy I provided was to them.
So you don't intend to have it put into the public library?
I can do that if that was desired.
Does the report that you did, is it any different fundamentally than a report you might do for the Division of Historic Preservation?
No, it's the same.
You said quite candidly that you didn't prepare the affidavit. So the line in paragraph 7 that the report meets the intent of the City of St. Albans land development regulations, is that your own thinking?
I think I misspoke or I misunderstood the question when that was asked to me. I prepared a response that then
To Mr. Keefe's?
yes, and then
Mr. Feed is the person you're referring to there.
okay, their firm took what I prepared and converted it into this affidavit format, which is what I was thinking about when he asked me who prepared the affidavit. I wouldn't know how to prepare a legal affidavit, but I prepared the language, was then converted to the affidavit. The response in there is my language.
So the line, this report meets the intent of the regulations, is your own?
Can you tell me which exhibit we're on? I'd just like to be able to refer to it.
It's 22,
Okay.
and it would be page 2. Well, I'm
Okay.
looking
Um,
You said paragraph 6?
No, I'm sorry, it's, I'm looking at the first one.
That would be in the back of Exhibit 20.
I'm sorry, so in back of 21, these are not serially numbered, but if you go after the photographs, then you see your first
yes, okay.
affidavit, and your, and page 2 of that, paragraph 7 is what I was looking
Page 2.
You say after the photographs?
for. After the photographs,
Yep.
it says affidavit, and then there's,
Paragraph 7 on page 2 of the affidavit portion of Exhibit 21.
have you got it?
Yes.
And is that your, is that your conclusion?
Yes, in fact, this one I did not write, but I did read and sign it. And you're asking me if number 7, if I agree that that's correct?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
Is it part of a review of this sort that you would look beyond the structure itself to the neighborhood?
No. No, the report is purely about the building itself.
Then is the locus of a historic building irrelevant in historic preservation analysis?
Well, this was not an analysis. This was purely a documentation of the building itself, a record of the building. Yes, if you're analyzing the significance of a structure, where it's located is a piece of that, but that's not what this was. This was purely to record the building as it exists today.
Were you asked not to analyze it?
No, that was not part of the intent of the report.
But within your work, you have done analysis,
Yes,
and you could have done analysis.
if I was asked to, but I wasn't.
Well, do you feel as though a proper review of the Smith House ought to include such an analysis?
Your
No,
Honor, I'm going to
no.
object to the question. I'd ask this witness to add something to the language of the ordinance. And what we're here for is to determine whether the application for a demolition permit conforms with the requirements of the ordinance, not whether it's conforming with some other notion of public policy or proper historic preservation evaluations generally. All of this questioning is taking place in the context of our stipulation that the building is historically significant. And so I've tried to give the council as much leeway as possible about this, but now asking whether the ordinance is proper and only asking for a report, I think is beyond the
If I could respond?
Yes, please.
The focus of the bylaw is that the documentation would survive the demolition of the building. And so the qualities of that review become essential because that's all that's left, the photographs and the analysis. And so in this case, I think it's fair game to inquire as to what the report could have done if it were done looking at that as an object.
Okay. I'm going to overrule the objection. Let me explain why. The pending appeal challenges an application that raises 3 issues. Is this building or some component of it historic? If so, may it be demolished as the currently is planned? And if the answer, and if demolition is approved, has the ordinance been satisfied, specifically subsection I-E-1, subsection So as to the first thing, we have stipulations that the Smith House portion of this building is historic. And as to the third legal question, that specifically would be whether or not this report satisfies the report requirements of subsection EI1. I don't believe that, I don't understand if the statute requires a recitation or an opinion in the report as to whether demolition is justified.
I agree.
With that said, I think because one of the issues that's before the court is whether demolition has been justified by the applicant, I think it's appropriate to allow the appellants to pose that question to Ms. Jamel, even though she's been called solely as a witness by the applicant to satisfy subsection EI1. I mean, the alternative of that could be that we can complete this examination, we could let Ms. Jamel to sit down in the back of the courtroom, instruct her not to leave, and then when the applicant's case in chief is over, we could allow the appellants to call her up to pose that question to her. I'd rather go this route of allowing the question to proceed now within a limited scope, so that we can move forward. Mr. Rafi.
Well, Your Honor, essentially what you're saying is that although Ms. Gemelli was not hired to do an analysis of the neighborhood, so she's not our expert about an analysis of the neighborhood. She is being asked by the opponents to provide her expert opinion about the neighborhood, converting her into their expert. They've never disclosed her as an expert. They've never told us that they were going to seek her expert opinion about this. The ordinance talks about the structure. It doesn't talk about the neighborhood. We've stipulated that the neighborhood is on the historic register.
No, that's why I understand your concern, Mr. Peter. That's why I said limited scope. I don't understand the question that's posed as to asking Ms. Jamel to provide an independent opinion for the appellant's behalf. You're exactly right. Clearly, they haven't retained her. They haven't disclosed that beforehand. But what I understood Mr. Gillies to ask is, do you have an opinion? And I think this is just as he could have certainly asked that question in discovery of, in the course of working for the applicant, did she form an opinion? And I thought the question was related to the demolition request, not the neighborhood. I may have gotten.
If I could be, if I could.
But we probably ought to go back to the question, because I thought the question was, shouldn't there have been an analysis of the neighborhood?
I thought we moved past that.
No, I think we did. I am focusing on that first sentence. The significance of the structure, gardens, landscaping, and outbuildings, if any, shall be assessed and recorded. And I'm suggesting that a review of this sort should include an analysis when they use the word assess, rather than just documentation. I think we won't, I'm trying to suggest that Ms. Gemelli's report may be limited in not analyzing the structure.
So the significance of those items.
I don't think we can just go, well, it's on the National Register, it's significant, we're done, sit down. I realize there's a lot more.
Well, yeah. Ms. Gemelli's report is much beefier than that.
Yes, it is. But it doesn't, but apparently doesn't include an analysis. An analysis in the sense of a conclusion about the integrity. It's a documentation. It's a documentary film of it. But there is no elaboration of a conclusion about.
Well, let's do this in two steps so we can move forward. Let's find out from Ms. Gemelli if she has an opinion, as an assessment beyond what her report entails. Because I take the report to have an assessment, not just a report. testified to and disclosed in your report there, is there some additional assessment about the significance of the structure, gardens, landscaping? I don't think there's any other questions here, right? Do you? And if you do, could you reveal it? Is this have we gotten more legalistic than we should?
No, but the question is beyond the scope of what I did for the project. The purpose of my report was purely to document the building. And if you go to the documentation standards that I followed, that's all that it's asked to do. There was no purpose or intent to do an assessment or form an opinion about what was appropriate. It was purely a record of the building, and that's what the intent of a documentation report is.
So we're all anxious to know if you did form an opinion about that.
About what?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Form an opinion about what? I may object when I know what opinion he's asking for, but
The court was asking if you had formed an opinion about the significance beyond documentation.
The documentation report is clear. The building has significance on its own and is part of an historic district. What more can I say?
And back to where we started, the neighborhood or the context, the placement of it on the corner of Congress and Maiden Lane.
It's a piece of the historic district, yes.
But in terms of a view shed or in terms of a fit of the neighborhood, do you have an opinion on it?
I didn't look at it from a point of view of what would be different if it was gone.
Good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just had a couple of questions. I need your help to just clarify.
Sure.
So these reports under this specific section of the St. Albans regulations, have you conducted similar reports of other historic buildings?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And did the purpose of your report flow from a proposal to demolish that historic building?
Yes.
Okay. And I was curious about what usually happens with these reports. In addition to giving it to the person who retains you, the owner, does the city have a desire to keep a copy of this, or what?
Typically, it's happening as part of a review process, usually a federal review process. And along with the client getting a copy, the State Historic Preservation Office gets a copy because they're part of that review process. And usually a local library or historical society will get another copy.
So if delivery of copies of your reports to those entities isn't required, would you be opposed to the applicant being directed to provide copies to the neighboring library and to the city development office?
It wouldn't be a problem from my point of view.
Okay.
Your Honor, just to be clear, the ordinance doesn't say where it goes.
That's why I asked.
That's why
My client will be happy to provide copies to the Historic Society, the library, the City Hall, whoever is interested in having a copy.
Thank you. When you were talking with Mr. Gillis, when you were talking with Mr. Gillis, he asked for your help in defining the integrity, the present integrity of a historic structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that's always a challenge. I mean, as a building lasts longer, it weathers, and it needs more maintenance. And you made an interesting point I thought was very important. You said one way you suggested to help define integrity is would the original owner, I think you said, how would the original owner recognize it?
Mm-hmm.
How would Mr. Smith recognize his former home today, in your opinion?
I think it would be very clear that it was his former home and that there'd been some additions made, but that the original building was still readable behind those additions.
Okay. You said you did prepare other such reports. About how many?
Oh, goodness.
Let's keep it to the city of St. Albans.
Oh, I don't think I've done any others here in St.
So,
Albans.
In Franklin County.
Most of my work is, I don't think I've done any in Franklin County. They've been mostly in Washington County. Where else have I done them? Up in Newport, East Rygate, Barry, and
Spread over
Yes.
east and northern Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Mr. Fee?
Thank you, Your Honor. As I recall Mr. Gillies' question, he asked you about the integrity of the exterior of the building.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have an opinion about the integrity of the interior of the Smith house?
It retains quite a bit of its original layout and a lot of the decorative trim, as well as original structural materials, walls, ceilings, floors, that sort of thing. Certainly, I think we'd all agree it's in poor condition right now, but
Now, I'm going to represent to you, and I'll ask you to make this assumption, that there has been testimony that the wall of the Smith house that adjoins all of the additions
Mhm.
to it is structurally in trouble and unsound and has begun collapsing. Do you have any independent observations of any of that condition, any cracking in those walls?
I wasn't there looking for that sort of thing.
Okay. If the testimony was that one of the four major walls of the building couldn't be preserved as it is, would that affect your judgment about the integrity of the exterior of the Smith?
No. No, the building still retains, it's clearly a building of a certain era with additions from a later period, all of which are, represent important architectural features of those styles. And
Sure.
the building clearly represents a building of its style and era.
Okay. In your report, Exhibit 21, I think you highlighted that on pages 10 and 11, you discussed the historical significance of the building, correct?
Yes.
And that significance is evaluated not just by the building, but by the uses, its connection to historical uses and historical trends, men's club and so on, correct?
Yes.
And it sounded as if counsel was trying to imply that you made no assessment about whether the building had historical significance. Would that assumption be accurate, that you made no assessment of its significance?
The building is significant. It's listed on the National Register. The whole purpose of my report was to document the fact that it had some significance both architecturally and historically. I guess you'd have to define assessment.
In a way, it's almost as if saying it's on the National Register is a shorthand for...
Absolutely. If it's
Everybody
on
knows
the...
it, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, with regard to the National Register, is there actually a list of the...
There is in Washington. I believe now it's electronic, but yeah.
Yeah.
You believe now what?
It's electronic.
Yep.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Gillis?
So if a building is on the National Register, if it's determined to be significant, if it has integrity, does that play any role in the decision as to whether it should be demolished?
Your Honor, I'm going to object
No.
to the question. It's outside the scope of the direct and redirect.
What say you, Mr. Gillis?
I think it's, we talked in the redirect, we talked about the National Register, we talked about significance, we talked about integrity, and we talked about it in terms of the structure itself. And that while I perfectly accepting that Ms. Gemelli began her analysis, her assessment, if you will, with the idea that the building would be demolished, I think it's fair to make the connection between the two questions.
I'm going to allow the question to be answered. We were beginning to get away from the scope of direct and redirect.
This is my only recross
We're not
question.
saying that.
Your Honor, I have an additional objection, which is that under the ordinance, the decision whether or not something, a historic structure can be demolished, entails a physical feasibility analysis and an economic feasibility analysis before that conclusion can be drawn.
Right.
The whole idea of whether or not this kind of report is required is it's got to be a building of historic significance. To that extent, we've stipulated that. But I don't think there's been any basis to elicit this witness's opinion about whether it's economically or physically feasible to restore or preserve this building. And so I would ask that this question be stricken.
I didn't understand the question be solicited in that kind of opinion. Mr. Gillis, what are you asking?
It was not. It was a simple question. It was not related to the other sections of the bylaw.
Okay, can you rephrase the question again, pose it, please?
So that a building that is on the National Register, that has integrity, that has been determined to be significant, does all of that play any role in a decision to demolish in your field?
Depends on who's making the decision. It would not necessarily stop something from being demolished. Being on the National Register does not prevent that unless a community has some sort of regulation that prevents it. And then that's something the community needs to enforce.
Thank you.
All right. Anything further with this witness? Mr. Melvin, thanks so much for your
Thank you.
testimony. Hey, I'm going to take a minute.
I thank you for that.
All right, very good. So it's, if that clock back there says we're right at 10:30. So let's be back in our seats at 10:40, okay?
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, very good. Stand, follow on.